In this episode, we're going to look at how to use Stytch to set up passwordless user authentication for a Vue 3 app running on .NET 6. Hey everyone, Wes here with Productive Dev. I hope you're doing well. I'm really excited about this episode because we're going to dive into a topic that I think can be really challenging for a lot of developers, particularly when we're working on new projects, and that is the topic of user authentication. We're going to look at using a platform that I've really enjoyed integrating with lately. It's called Stytch, and it's a really sort of developer-focused, API-driven platform for user authentication that makes it really easy to set up user auth in a new application. Now, the use case that we're going to be working through in this video is integrating Stytch for passwordless auth in the form of magic links, which are links that can get emailed to our users so that they can basically click a link from directly within their inbox and be authenticated and redirected in an authenticated state back to our application. So the particular application that we're going to look at in this video is a Vue 3 and .NET 6 web app. So we'll have the web API written in .NET 6 and the front end, the client side code written in Vue 3. We're going to look at setting up a simple login form that will be on the landing page of our gift shop, and we're going to have a single input where a user provides their email address. This email address is going to be sent through our backend, which is running .NET 6, and making a request out to Stytch's platform. Stytch offers a really fantastic API and a number of different options for user authentication. In this video, we're going to look specifically at sending our users magic links with the Magiclink API. So users of our application will receive magic links in their inbox that they'll be able to click on and arrive back at the gift shop at a storefront in an authenticated state. So we'll look at just how easy it is to get set up here. We'll walk through getting set up on Stytch's platform itself, and we'll take a look very quickly through some of their documentation. They have fantastic API documentation and a wide variety of SDKs for us to use. In our case, we're going to be interacting directly with their API from our .NET 6 application. So this is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to work through this example from no authentication all the way to receiving an actual email in our sandbox environment. And so I'm really excited to get started. We're also going to extend this application over several weeks during the spring to look at how to actually integrate payments into the application and cover a variety of other topics. So I'm looking forward to that as well. But today is all about user auth using Stytch. And so let's dive in now and take a look at getting that piece set up. Okay, so here's a look at the application that we'll be building in this video. What we have is essentially a gift shop that has a passwordless authentication. So a user can log into the gift shop here to send gifts. The project is kind of designed to be a small project for maybe like an internal gift giving application where you can send small gifts to members of your team or within your organization. And we want the ability for our users to log into this application using passwordless authentication. And for this, we're going to be using Stytch, which will make this sort of complex authentication workflow actually pretty easy to set up and get started with. So the idea here is that we provide an email and then we click send magic link. Now there are some things that are happening with our own code here, both from a Vue perspective, we're using Vue 3 on the front end here, as well as our backend, which is .NET 6. And our backend API is actually what's doing all of the real communication with the Stytch platform. And so it's interacting with Stytch's API to actually send a user an email at this email address. If the user doesn't exist yet, then Stytch is going to send an email to actually say, hey, you're welcome to Mindful Gifts, and we're going to create this user. Otherwise, if the user does exist, it's just going to provide them with a link to log in as an existing user. So if we head over to the inbox, we see that we can now log in, or we have an email to log in to Mindful Gifts. So we have a nice templated email here with a big button, and we can see that the link expires in 1 hour. So we're going to go ahead and log in, and you'll see that what happens now is that we're actually redirected back to, in this case, localhost port 3000, where our gift shop application is running, except now we see a sort of storefront. So we can see our email address here, as well as a number of different products that we may wish to send to our coworkers or to other members in our organization as a sort of kudos or thanks. So the idea here is that, if I go back and visit the login route, I actually get redirected as an authenticated user back to the storefront. And likewise, if I sign out and we go back to the login page, but I try to hit the route for the storefront again, I can't until I log in again. So this is going to be a really fun project to set up and get started with. I'm going to extend this project over the course of the spring so that we can actually work on different aspects of it. But at the start here, we're going to work on one of the most important aspects, which is user authentication. And I've really enjoyed using Stytch to set it up for sending these magic links. This is going to involve a little bit of work on the client side and quite a bit of work on the back end in .NET 6. So I'm excited to get started. Let's take a look now at our Stytch dashboard where we can kind of see how to get set up with this type of authentication. So I've logged into Stytch. I've already created an account here. If you haven't created an account yet, you can just very easily create one with your own email address. And it's free to get set up and to use with an initial user here in a sort of sandbox environment. So we have a test environment and a production environment that they provide us access to. And we're just going to be working in the sandbox environment with our initial user. So you can see that we're provided on our dashboard with this integration checklist where we can configure some redirect URLs. They provide a lot of really fantastic documentation. It's a very developer-forward, developer-centric, API-driven platform. I really enjoy that about it. And we can see a diagram of kind of how the flow of a user working with the Stytch API, how this is actually going to work with our magic links or our passwordless authentication. We can see basically what happens is that on our application that's running client side, this is our Vue application, a user is going to provide their email address, which sends a request to our server, in this case a .NET 6 backend. That .NET 6 application is then going to make a post request to, in this case, a Magic Links endpoint that Stytch is hosting with that user's email. Now, on Stytch's side, they're going to check to see whether or not we actually have a user with that email in our particular sort of domain in Stytch. If we do have a user, then we're simply going to send a login link, or Stytch is going to send a login link to the user. If not, they're going to send a sign-up email to the user. And so that goes off to the user's inbox. Stytch will then return us a user ID and a flag, a Boolean, to tell us whether or not this action just created a new user. At that point, we have a user ID and we can work with that user ID within our own domain logic. Say, for instance, getting a user from storage based on the Stytch user ID and working with it in whatever way that we would like. So user has now just received a magic link in their email from Stytch. It has our templating. Things look very nice. It's sort of sent on behalf of our organization. And when a user clicks on this link, they're going to be redirected to our website with a special token. And we can actually then send this token back off to Stytch with a Magiclink authentication endpoint and verify that indeed this user is who they say they are, that the token is actually valid. Once that's authenticated successfully, Stytch is going to obviously tell our server that that was a successful response. And at this point, we can set a user session and we can consider our login successful. So in order for this to get set up, we can see that we have to basically set up a number of different endpoints ourselves. One to actually tell Stytch to generate this magic link and send off this email with the login or create action for logging in or creating a new user. And we also have to create some type of endpoint to authenticate our user with the token that they come back to our website with. So we're going to set all of that up. We're going to take a look at a .NET 6 project that has some of the sort of boilerplate already scaffolded out for us so we can focus specifically on the auth piece of the integration. So with this, let's take a look at what we have set up on the client side and what we have set up on the server side. And we'll look at how we can then return to our Stytch dashboard here to configure our redirect URLs and grab our API keys. So let's dive into our project now. Okay, so I've switched to a version of the application which has the sort of UI scaffolded out for us and a little bit of the backend set up so that we can actually integrate Stytch as our user authentication piece. Now, you'll see that we can visit the login page here. We can click the link to send a magic link and we get a message back, but currently none of that is wired up yet. We can also visit localhost 3000 and see the storefront and sign out. Clicking sign out actually does nothing. So we don't currently need to be an authenticated user to be authorized to view this route. Likewise, we can visit login and the storefront without being logged in whatsoever. So let's take a look at actually wiring up what we need to wire up first from a front-end perspective, and then we'll work our way from the front end backward into the .NET layer, and we'll also look at how we're storing data on our server side using Postgres. So I'm going to head into an IDE here, and what we have is a Vue 3 project. I'm running this using Vite, and we also have Tailwind set up here for the UI. I really like using Tailwind. It provides a really nice clean UI, particularly for new projects. If you don't have an existing design system, it's really easy to work with Tailwind. So I have that set up here with a Tailwind config. We have a simple Vite config here as well. That is pretty standard just from a new Vite project. We have set it up using PostCSS, so we have a PostCSS config with two empty object properties for Tailwind CSS and auto prefixer. In terms of things that I have installed in the project, I have Vue, of course, Vue Router, and Vuex. We have a very simple Vue store that we'll look at shortly, and a number of dev dependencies, again, for Tailwind, TypeScript, Vite, some types, and the Vue.js plugin Vue, PostCSS, and auto prefixer. So pretty standard, very small Vue 3 project. Now under the source directory, I've organized things such that we have an empty components directory. We can actually get rid of that. But under pages here, we have a home page and a login page, both Vue components that we'll take a look at shortly. We have a main.ts, so a main TypeScript file here. We can see our application is just mounted to the standard DOM element with ID of app. And we're going to be using a very simple store that we set up and a very simple router that we set up. Our router is going to be a really important piece here for checking whether or not a user is authenticated before allowing them to visit a route in our application. We have a main.css file that gets imported in main.ts, and this just has a number of Tailwind directives in it for the 3 layers of Tailwind that we're using, which are base, components, and utilities. Then in app.vue, we just have a bare bones top-level component that contains a single div in its template where we render our router view. And then for the body, we're using another view directive here to apply just a background of a dark gray and white text for an empty, any empty view. Okay, so if we head into login, we've got quite a lot of UI here. Notice that we have some data. We want to know whether or not the view is loading. This will be used when we actually make an HTTP request out to send a magic link from our login page. We want to render some type of loading animation so that a user knows that, this request is in process. And then we'll have a success message that lets the user know that a magic link was sent. And we're going to bind the value of our single input field to a user's email. The computed property of send message we'll see in the template is just going to either say sending when our UI is loading, or it's going to provide the sort of call to action, if you will, of send a magic link. Okay, and then we have a send magic link method. We actually need to fill this out. This is sort of a stubbed out method here where basically you can see we're setting the loading data to true. Our success message is cleared out to empty string, and then we're just for now console logging that we're sending a magic link request. Then we're setting a success message as check your email, and then setting loading to false. So clearly we're not doing actual business logic here. This is just a sort of placeholder method so that we can actually start writing our code to interact with our backend here. Then we have a pretty straightforward UI. I wanted to make the login form look relatively nice. We will be working on this app throughout a number of videos, and so we have a simple sort of card-like login form where we have sort of 2/3 of that card being the form, if you will, where a user puts in their email, and then 1/3 of the sort of card just for a visual element. This is where, if we scroll all the way down, we just have this sort of visual element with a gradient that's pretty straightforward and easy to do with Tailwind, and then a little emoji icon for our logo. If we take a look though at the sort of main part of our login form here, we send the user a message to enter their email to log in. And this should actually be 2 words. And we have our input field here, our Magiclink button that has a vModel, so some data binding to the email. I want to call this ID something else besides Magiclink button. We could call this Magiclink email. And then quite a bit of Tailwind classes here to sort of create the particular input that we're looking for, with a placeholder of the email, type text, and then we have our button, which we're going to show only if there's not currently a success message visible. So when we do show our success message, it's going to take the place of the button itself. We're going to disable the button, or give it a sort of disabled class, which we can control the look and feel of when our UI is loading. And when we click this button, we're going to invoke our send magic link method that we looked at above. Now, when it is loading, we're going to show a sort of loading animation here, just this sort of animate pulse Tailwind animation, and the button message is going to be controlled by this computed property of send message, which changes depending on whether or not we're loading. And then ultimately we have a success message here, which is an empty string unless it's assigned, which it is assigned after we successfully send a magic link, at least in our stubbed out method. Okay, that is really sort of what we're starting with here on the login form. On the home screen, I just want to show you what we have set up so far. We won't be concerning ourselves with much of the home screen at this time. Basically, we are going to get the user's emails out of store, and we'll look at how they end up there shortly. And then we have a way to get some images. This is a way to get images using Vite from locally stored images in the project. I have them in an images directory here. And so we're just storing the images locally for now for the initial version of the app, and we're using v-for to iterate over that list of images, that array of images, and basically just presenting them out to the screen. So not much here. The only thing of note for us that we'll worry about in this video with regards to auth is the ability to sign a user out, and we do this with clicking the sign out button. So this will be some logic that we also need to implement. Currently it's just an empty method. Okay, and then if we take a look at how all of this is sort of set up from a router perspective, we have this router directory with an index.typescript file in it. We're going to build a custom auth guard for this, which basically looks at whether or not a route requires authentication. In this case, our storefront, which is at the root URL of the app, does require authentication. And so we're going to call router.beforeach and handle authentication in that case. This is where the more sort of complex front-end logic will live for this application. Otherwise, we have a second path here to login, which has no requirements for authentication. We need unauthenticated users to be able to visit the login page so that they can generate their magic link to log in to our application. So a pretty standard, simple Vue 3 router that we have set up here. We'll take a look at the handle auth logic momentarily. For now, this is in an authguard.ts file, which just takes the user to the next route. We have no auth guard really in place here, and this is where the bulk, again, of our front-end business logic will live. So I think with this as some background, we can actually get set up implementing the business logic. And for this, perhaps we'll start with the login view itself. So really what I want to do is when we send a magic link here, we're going to set is loading to true. That part's fine. And we can even leave this part with the success message as empty string. What we're going to do is remove the console.log, and we want to put all of that business logic here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create a try catch block. And in the try section, what we're going to do is use the fetch client to make a request to an endpoint that we are going to expose in .NET 6 with our web API. So we're going to use fetch to make a post request with simple content type header application JSON here. And for our body, we're going to JSON stringify an object with the email that we've actually bound to our email input that we're tracking on our data object here in this Vue component. So this is very simple. All we're doing is making a simple post request to an endpoint that we've exposed, and our backend is going to handle taking that email address and working with it to collaborate with the Stytch platform to basically either sign that user up for a new account or to log them in and just send them a simple login link. Then we'll set our success message to check your email for a magic link to log in. Otherwise, we'll just have a simple catch here for now. What I'm going to do is just console.error, some exception. And so some very simple business logic here. For now, we may also wish to think about the UI a bit and have the ability to set an error message that we might set when we catch and throw an exception here. We would also want to handle the case when this response came back as a non-successful response. That's something that we actually sort of control in a sense because we are interfacing with our own API here. So if Stytch comes back with some type of error, we may have our API essentially sort of handle that and return some type of specific response that our client, which is also under our control, will handle gracefully. But for now, we're just kind of keeping things simple to get it wired up. Okay, and we can go ahead and just remove those other two lines. Now we have a way at the very least to make a post request to our backend. So send magic link is the method, and we can see that this is invoked whenever our user clicks on the button that we've created to send a magic link, and we are binding the email property from data in our Vue component here to the input where our user provides their email. So ultimately this ends up on the payload that we're sending to our backend on this JSON object. Okay, so let's take a look at what that endpoint looks like on the .NET side. So here we have a simple .NET 6 minimal web API. This is the new paradigm in .NET 6 for small web API applications. And it provides us with a little bit more convenience than previous versions of .NET for very small web API projects, where we can actually define essentially all of the web layer, if you will, most of our web layer logic in a single file in program.cs. So we no longer have a startup.cs file necessarily. We could use one if we like, but in this case, we can actually do all of our dependency injection and configuration setup directly in program.cs. What we have is basically a simple program.cs file, and I've scaffolded out the 3 endpoints that we'll need to work with, including the create or login endpoint that we're working with currently on the front end. And what I've done is simply set up the controller, the endpoints in our controller here, and we'll work together to build out the business logic that is invoked when we hit these endpoints. So our service for this, it lives in a business logic namespace, and we have an auth service that we'll look at shortly. So essentially, we are going to hit our create or login endpoint with a post request, and we're going to retrieve an auth request object, which in this case is just simply that email address that we can see here, just a string, from the post request body. And in .NET 6 with this minimal web API, we can actually inject an implementation of an auth service by providing the interface here as a parameter to the controller method that gets wired up above. We'll take a look at the setup here in a moment. But we basically have this auth request containing the email and the auth service itself. And so we're going to use the auth service to invoke a method called send magic link with that email. If the response that we get back here, which is going to be an auth response object that we control, if it's successful, we're going to return 200 to the client, an HTTP 200 OK response with the response payload there. Otherwise, we're going to say that this was a 400 HTTP response bad request. So if we take a look at this interface, send magic link, It's going to be an asynchronous task here, which again is going to return a type of Auth Response. It's going to take in an email, and if we take a look at what's on the Auth Response, we're going to send back some information like whether or not it was successful, what the status code was, and here importantly we're going to retrieve a session token and user ID for this user. We'll also see the last time that the user logged in. Some of this is going to require collaboration with an additional endpoint on Stytch's API called the user endpoint, which we'll take a look at in a little while. So back in program.cs, that's all there is to this endpoint in terms of invoking it. We'll walk through the business logic here in just a moment. Just want to show you what else is set up in program.cs. It's a pretty simple API. We call add HTTP client. This gives us access to use an HTTP client factory in any of our classes. We're going to set up cores here because we're actually running on two different hosts, if you will, localhost port 8080 in the course of in terms of the API, and localhost port 3000 in terms of our front end. We're going to add options to enable us to use the options pattern. This will enable us to strongly type the settings that we need to use to set up to connect to Stytch, which we'll take a look at shortly. Then our dependency injection is simply injecting this one class that we have, this Auth Service, with an instance of Stytch service. And we're going to configure our strongly typed Stytch options to map to a section of our configuration that's called Stytch, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. Finally, I'm using EF-Core and have just set up a very simple DB context called Mindful DB Context. It's a Postgres database which we can connect to locally and has a single table in it called app users. We're going to use this so that we can track our own users in our own domain here and correlate them with user IDs that Stytch is managing and that users are sort of associated with on Stytch's platform when they're authenticating. So back in program.cs, we'll basically allow cores from any origin for now. This is not something that we would want to do in production, but for now, just working locally, it's fine. And we're going to now dive into our first post request endpoint. So remember, this is that post request that's coming from our front end when a user says, hey, please send me a magic link. So in order to do that, we need to implement this method sendMagicLink. So in our auth service here, which I've actually called Stytch service, so I'm going to go ahead and rename this to Stytch service. This service is going to be responsible for all of the interaction that we have with the Stytch platform over their API. So to that end, we're going to need to create an HTTP client. So we can inject HTTP client factory here. We'll also inject a simple logger. We're going to use the options pattern to inject some strongly typed options that we'll need to actually connect to Stytch with. So rather than hard code any of this in our application code, we want to separate the configuration out, and we'll do that with this simple class Stytch options that we'll take a look at shortly. And then we have a database accessible to us. With the options pattern, note that we just resolve the value of the generic options here by calling .value. So that backing field is of type Stytch options, and .NET provides this iOptions container, if you will, this object that sort of wraps the options as an injectable interface here. So we then have the three methods that we need to implement. We need to implement a method first of all here for sending a magic link. So that's what we'll focus on immediately. We'll take a look for a moment here at what the Stytch options are, and these are things that we need to configure. So Stytch will provide us with a value for the environment. In this case, this will be tests. In the case of our sandbox, a project ID or PID here, PID, that Stytch will provide us with, as well as an API secret. And we can configure things like how long a session duration is valid for. So I've configured that with session duration minutes. And then we just need to set up some URLs here. This just is a convenience. I'm going to configure Stytch's own authenticate session URL, authenticate magic link URL, and login or create URL. We also have a user endpoint and URLs for our own magic link URL and sign up sign up Magiclink URL for login and sign up. So we'll take a look at this shortly. What this gets mapped to or mapped from is an app settings file. So we have appsettings.development.json here. This will override our appsettings.json when we're in development mode. And let's take a look now at where we get our PID and our secret ID from. You can see that we can configure session duration minutes here, but the first thing that we need to do is go find these two values, and we can do that at the Stytch dashboard. So over at the Stytch dashboard, if you select API keys, you'll find that we have a project ID or PID here. What I'm going to do is just copy this, make sure that it's the right one for this project. And then the secret, I'm also going to ensure is the right one for this project. So we'll copy this. And there we go. So that's updated properly. Now you see this authenticate session URL, the authenticate Magiclink URL, the login or create URL, and the user endpoint. These are all Stytch URLs. They're basically just API endpoints. And so at the time of this recording on V1 of the Stytch API, they're here at test.stytch.com/v1/sessions authenticate in the case of authenticate session URL, and Magiclinks authenticate for the Magiclink URL, and then Magiclinks/email/login or create for the login or create URL, and then /users for the user endpoint. So where I got these from is in the Stytch documentation. If you head over to, let's see here, the docs link, and we want to look at the API reference. And the first thing that we can see is that the API documentation is really nice. Almost everything here is annotated. We've got example requests and responses. Response objects here, you can change what you see in terms of the request depending on sort of the platform you're using. Note that C# at the time of this recording is not yet does not yet have an SDK, but if you're using Python for your backend, or Go, or Ruby, or Kotlin, or Swift, then or Node, then you can actually see how to use the sort of backend Stytch clients here. I'm just looking at curl because it gives us an idea of the entire HTTP request, and this is something that we can translate very easily into .NET using the HTTP client. So that's what we'll be doing in this video. So these URLs that I'm getting, so for instance, for the ability to, in Magiclinks, if we take a look here, to log in or create a user, we get the URLs here, and so I'm just configuring that in our configuration so that we don't need to hard code that link anywhere in the code. Likewise, when we take a look at session management, we can look at authenticating a session. We can get that URL here. So that's why we see sessions authenticate as our authenticate session URL, and then similarly we have one to get something from the users. So from the users API, getting a particular user by ID as a path parameter. So just for convenience, I'm configuring them here in our config. Okay, so be sure your project ID and secret are correct and that you're using the test environment here. One other thing to note while we're in the configuration is, as I mentioned, we're using a Postgres database. Setting up the database is out of scope of this video, but I have lots of other content with .NET projects where I'm following the same pattern here, just using EF Core in a code-first fashion to build a Postgres database with the very simple schema in this case of course, just having our single app user table, our app user object in our MindfulDB context here. So with all of that set up, we have some context now for how our sendMagicLink method kind of needs to work here. And in fact, I also want to note that if you're following along for a different platform and you just take a look at from all their docs and their guides, you can see step by step how to set up a new login with the API with a nice diagram here, but Stytch just kind of very helpfully walks us through what we need to do. We've already built our login view, and now we need to create our route for authentication. So technically from their steps here, we're on step 2, and you can see they give us some directions here. Create a route that will act as your Magiclink endpoint. Users will be directed there from the login email, and the route should accept a token as a query parameter that we'll use to authenticate. I do want to note very quickly that the Stytch documentation has a very helpful set of guides for a number of different workflows that they have here. One of them is, of course, emailing magic links, and you can follow step by step, sort of at a high level, what you need to do when you're setting up a new login with the API, as we're doing. Takes you through everything that you need to sort of be aware of. We already have a login view, of course, and then it tells you that you need to start creating a route for authentication, which we'll take a look at shortly. And our redirect URLs need to be set up on the dashboard. And then, of course, we need to send a magic link to log in our user. This is all things that we're going to be walking through ourselves here. I just wanted you to know about the very helpful guide that Stytch has published here as part of their documentation as well. Okay, so back in our .NET project with send magic link, what I'm going to do is a few things here up front. First of all, we're going to log information that that we're sending a magic link to a particular email address, and then we're going to instantiate an instance of a new HTTP client using our HTTP client factory. So in .NET, the HTTP client should be this short-lived object that we use to simply make a single request within the scope of a method. So that's what we're doing here, is we're creating a new instance of an HTTP client using that injectable HTTP client factory. Then we're going to create our payload, which will be a new Stytch magic link request. Now, this Stytch magic link request is something that lives in a models namespace that I have here, and then a Stytch namespace, and then under magic links we have this Stytch magic link request, and we can see that it contains an email, a magic link URL, and sign up magic link URL set of properties. I am mapping the JSON property name to these to be what Stytch expects, and so they're using camel case throughout, or they're using snake case rather throughout. And so I'm just providing the snake case variation of these property names for us. So we have our email, login magic link URL, and sign up magic link URL that we need to populate. So we have those here. The email is the email that gets passed to this method, of course. And then our HTTP, our login magic link URL and sign up magic link URLs are what are configured on our Stytch options object that we looked at a moment ago. Then we're just going to serialize this payload as JSON, and we can use that with some empty JSON serializer options here, and then use JSON serializer.serialize to serialize that payload into a JSON string. Now I'm going to set up a basic try catch block here. And in our try block, what we're going to do is set up our auth headers. So we need to set an accept header of application JSON. We're going to use basic authorization here to set a encoded auth header value. Now this is basically going to be a combination of the project ID and the secret key that we have. And so we'll look at how that is set up here momentarily. Essentially though, what we're doing is just simply building out a new instance of an HTTP request message. That's going to be a post request, and we're going to use the login or create URL that we need to make that post request to. So to build out this auth string, I have a new private method here that we need to implement. So this is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to build this auth string, as I said, as a combination of that PID value separated by a colon here and then our secret. And then we need to base64 encode that string for it to work properly, and so we use convert to base64 string, and we use the UTF get bytes method on the auth string that we have interpolated here. And then basically the value is going to be basic auth, so we prefix it with basic space and then that base64 encoded auth string, and we return it. That's our header value for our authorization header. Now all we need to do is actually send that request. So we await HTTP client send async with that request that we just built up. From that, we're going to get an HTTP response message back from the Stytch API in this case. This is effectively going to be a login response. So I'm going to call this variable login response, and we're going to read that response back into a type that we created ourselves here called Stytch Magiclink Auth Response. Now this is a fairly significant response. It's going to give us an email ID, a request ID, a status code, when the user, whether or not the user was created with this request, that Boolean flag, and the user ID itself. And to avoid the compiler warnings here, I'm just going to set default values for the nullable types here. Okay, so Stytch is coming back to us with this data. And so we essentially read that data, deserialize it into our own object, and we now have this user login response to work with. And I'm just going to make this a bit more readable here, hopefully. And what we'll say is, if that response message returns a success status code and our user login response is not equal to null, then we're going to log that the magic link was successfully generated. And what I want to do at this point is, now that we have access to the user ID, we want to take a look in our own storage if we have a user that we map that can map to the user ID that we received back from Stytch. And so to do this, we're going to reach into the database using db app users first or default async. We're going to look for the user with a Stytch user ID that matches the user ID that comes back on that user login response. Now I want to go take a look at appdb users here. We'll look at the app user object, and we can see that we have our own GUID that we're using to track our user internally. This user has both an email ID and a Stytch user ID that are coming back from Stytch that we can associate with this user in our own storage, in our own domain. Okay, so back in our Stytch service, just need to correct a typo here. And so what I want to do is I want to know if Stytch tells us that, hey, I just created a new user for you. If that's the case, then user here would be null. So we actually want to create that user if they don't exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, if Stytch says, hey, on this user response, the user created flag was true, or in our case, we tried to look up a user and they were null for some reason, then we want to actually create that new user. So we instantiate a new app user here, and then we add them to our database and then call save changes async. So we await this. At this point, we have now saved a new user to our database, which can be tracked and correlated back with a Stytch user ID and email ID in our own context, in our own database. If all of this has happened, then we can now finally return a auth response of true here, with is success set to true on our own auth response and a user ID of the Stytch user ID. Our auth response itself, again, is just a Boolean flag whether or not it's successful. We could set the status code here if we like, and we can also pass back a session token, user ID, and last login if that's something we would like to do as well. Okay, so I'm going to head back into Stytch service. If we didn't get a success status code, then what we're going to do is simply log that there was an error generating the magic link. We're going to return a new auth response here of is success false and a user ID of null. And in the event of any exception for now, what we're going to do is again log that this was not successful. We'll return a null user ID for now. And in fact, we could even handle the empty string on any error state here for our user IDs, and we'll log the error. Okay, so with this set up, we should be ready to actually test out this integration in the sandbox environment. Remember that we do want to make sure that we have properly configured and assigned values for our PID as well as our secret. We also want to make sure that we have a database running here, and so I'll show you very briefly how I set up a local database for storing our users. So in the root of the server subdirectory, what I've done is just created a very simple Docker compose file. So we'll open this up to see what it looks like. It's very minimal, and it's just a way to set up a simple Postgres 13 instance The base image is actually Debezium Postgres 13 instance, just because I have a Debezium instance locally for several other projects. And I have set a simple username, password, and database of mindful dev here, exposing port 5432 and connecting that from the container to the host, and saving the mindful dev DB data volume so that we can have some data that persists the container lifetime. So pretty standard, very minimal development database setup, orchestrated using Docker Compose. So if you're interested in a deeper dive into .NET with Postgres, then be sure to check out other videos where I focus more in detail on data access between a Postgres database and .NET using EF Core. But for now, I have a Postgres database running. What I'll do is I'll stop it just to show you how to start it at the very least. So Docker container stop. I'm going to stop the container 5768 here. And we can see that there should now be no containers running, but we have this Docker Compose DB file here. What we'll do is run the command docker compose -f and then the name of the YAML file, and we're just going to say up-d to run it in detached mode. So our database is now running. You can see it running here with Docker PS, and I've already run my database migrations. What we just want is a live database that's running. Okay, so what I want to do now is head back to the Stytch dashboard for one final piece of setup that we should do, and that is setting our URLs, our redirect URLs. So from the dashboard, if we select redirect URLs here, again, we want to make sure that we're in our test environment, and we want to create our redirect URLs. So we can create separate URLs here for auth URLs for sign up, login, and invite. In our case, we're going to make them all the same, but the idea here is that our platform is going to accept some type of request from Stytch with a query parameter, and this query parameter will, in our case, contain a session token that we can then use to auth a user. So what we need to do now is click Create Redirect URL, and we're going to create redirect URLs for login, sign up, and invite, all to be the same. In our case, it's going to be localhost 8080, which is our API /auth. So this is a route that will act as our own Magiclink endpoint. So users who click on a Magiclink in their email are ultimately going to be redirected here, and this route is going to have a query parameter on it. And we're going to actually pull this token from the query parameter, and we're going to use that to authenticate our user with Stytch. So we'll go ahead and set this as default and confirm. We'll see all three links here on our dashboard: localhost port 8080 /auth, and this will be the next endpoint that we actually need to set up here. So let's now work on that auth endpoint. We'll come back into our code, we'll head back into program.cs, and you can see here we're exposing this auth endpoint. Now this is a GET request, and again we're going to be grabbing this token from a query parameter. So to grab that in .NET, we can use the from query attribute, and we're going to use our Auth Service here to redirect the user back to, in this case, localhost port 3000, which is where our UI is running with this session token from the response. So here you can see what we're doing is we're exposing this auth endpoint as a GET request, and we're going to accept as a query parameter the token that Stytch is sending back to us. We're going to use our own Auth Service here to actually authenticate that magic link. We're going to make an HTTP request with that token back to Stytch to authenticate the user with this token that they're arriving with, and if that's successful, we are ourselves going to redirect the user to our front-end application, which is currently running on port 3000 with a session token that we get back from Stytch. And so we're going to walk through this now step by step. Note that this URL here is something that we should ultimately also configure in our API. For now, it's just hard-coded as a URL here, pointing to our local instance. All right, so now we need to basically look at this Authenticate Magic link. This, again, is going to return an Auth Response, and in this case, it's going to accept a token. Remember, this is the token that we're getting from the query parameter. So we'll head back into Stytch service and we'll work on our Authenticate Magic link method. The first part of this is going to be very straightforward. It's going to be very similar to some of the code that we wrote for our first endpoint. We're going to basically log that we're authenticating a token here, and we're going to create a new instance of an HTTP client. We're going to start to craft our payload. This time this will be a Stytch Auth Magic link request, which contains a token and some session duration in minutes. We could get this also from our Stytch ops session duration minutes to configure that value. This magic link request just contains those two values themselves. So again, that token and the session duration minutes. And again, we are snake casing the JSON property names for Stytch. And we're going to serialize that payload into a JSON string. Now, what we're going to do is another simple try-catch block here, where we're going to make the auth request. This will be a new method that we need to set up. And for now, we're going to catch all exceptions and simply log that there was an error and return a new auth response instance with the success flag set to false. So making this auth request is a private method that we'll create. It's going to take the Authenticate Magic link URL from our Stytch options, that serialized payload, which contains the token that we received from the query parameter and some session duration number of minutes we'd like to request, and the HTTP client that we just instantiated. And we're just going to return the result, which is going to be an auth response directly from this method. So let's create that method now. I'm going to create it here at the bottom. And it'll be pretty straightforward, but we're going to reuse it, which is why I wanted to put it into a private method here. Again, we're going to build an encoded auth string, which we looked at previously. We're going to set our headers, accepting application JSON, and our basic auth header, which just was built using our built encoded auth string. And then we're going to pass as string content to this, our serialized payload. Then we're going to send that async as a post request, and we're going to read the result back as a Stytch Authenticate response. And if it's a successful response and the response object that comes back is not null, then we're going to return a new auth response object containing our status code, our session token, the user ID, and the user's last login. Otherwise, we're going to say that there was an error authenticating this user and return an auth response with the isSuccess flag set to false. Now, this Stytch Authenticate response is possibly the most robust model that we're dealing with here in this particular flow. You'll see that there is a lot of data that we can sort of derive from Stytch's response here. And so I've just gone through and typed it out into a C# type here, sort of creating our own mini C# SDK. And we can see this is where we get our status code, the Stytch session object that comes back as a nested object. We also get a list of authentication factors that we can see here. We can get back the user's email, the last time they authenticated, what type it was. In this case, this will be Magiclink. We also get a list of Stytch email factors back, so we can get a list of users' email addresses. And ultimately, we could also talk about working with JOTs here. So we have a session JWT. We have our session token. So currently, we're just concerned with the session token and the user ID that we want back, as well as the last time the user last accessed that for this particular session. So back in our Stytch service here, we basically put all of that into our own auth response and return it to our caller. So back up in our method, we're simply going to make the auth request and return that to the caller of Authenticate Magic link. So this is really all we need to do to set up the auth endpoint when we want to authenticate a token that's coming back to us when a user clicks a magic link. And then the last thing that we want to actually do then is be able to verify a user's session anytime that they are changing routes in our application. So we want to make sure that anytime a user is visiting a route that we want to authorize them to actually visit, we want to check whether or not that token is still valid using the session token that we've gotten back. So that's what our final endpoint is. This is for verifying a session. So in fact, if we go back to program.cs, we have this verify token endpoint, which is going to call auth service.verify session with an auth request token. So let's head back into Stytch service and we'll flesh out this final method, verify session. In this session, or in this method, we're going to also get back a Stytch user so that we can work with data from the Stytch user API. So things are going to look pretty familiar here at the top of this method. We're going to new up an HTTP client and this time build a Stytch session request, which just contains a session token. So Stytch is expecting us to send this as a string with the property name session token. And then we're going to set up a very similar try-catch block here where we make an auth request to this time the authenticate session URL, which remember is a different URL than we used previously. We're going to take that serialized payload which contains that session token and we're going to make an auth request with it, which is the same private method that we looked at in the previous method. If we get back a success result here, then we're actually going to call get Stytch user. So this method is returning a Stytch user response. So this is a method that we'll need to flesh out here momentarily. Otherwise, we're going to catch an exception here and return an empty Stytch user response. And again, if for some reason we didn't have a success response but didn't throw, we're also going to return a Stytch user response. So what does it mean to get a Stytch user? Well, for this, we're going to invoke our final Stytch endpoint, and we can look at that now. Here, we're going to use a new HTTP client to make a request to the Stytch Ops user endpoint with the user ID that Stytch has given us. So basically, we can, on the auth result, pull off the user ID when we just authenticated a user, and then we can use this to make a follow-up request to Stytch for the full details on that particular user. So we build that into a new HTTP request method. This is just a simple GET request to Stytch's user endpoint with the same headers that we've been using all along. This time we're going to read the results of this response into a Stytch user response object. So here we also have a really robust data model. This contains things like the status code, and actually we need to update that here. We also have a request ID, the user ID, name and emails and phone numbers for the user. So this model is actually, as I said, a very rich data model. In our case, we're simply going to basically get the user ID from this. And so we'll also perhaps look at getting users' emails, and we can display those on the front end as well, or use them for our own business logic here on the back end. So back in Stytch service here, we're getting those back into a variable called contents. And if this works successfully, we'll have that on the Boolean is success status code flag, and we'll verify that the contents were not null. In that case, we'll say we had a successful user authentication and return that user data back to the caller. Otherwise, we're just going to say, hey, there was an error authenticating this user, and we're going to return an empty Stytch user response to the caller. Okay, so this essentially is all of the business logic that we need for our 3 endpoints. We head back into program.cs. We have endpoints again for creating or logging in a user. This is sending that magic link to them. We then have a way to authenticate them with a token, so they get sent back to our application with a token. We can use that token and send it back to Stytch and validate it, ensure that they can be authenticated. And then finally, we have a way to verify that token, and from the response that Stytch sends us back, we can get things like the user's email and phone numbers and any other data that Stytch itself may be tracking on the user as they navigate through our application. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and start the application. We can do this with .NET Run in the API directory. And so we can see we're running on port 8080 over HTTP. Our front-end application is currently running, so let's open up the browser to port 3000. Okay, so here we are back at our login screen, and I'm going to open up the inspector and move to the network tab just to debug any potential issues that we may run into. and we're going to enter in our email. So be sure to use the email that you used to sign up for your Stytch test account, and then we're going to select Send Magic Link. So you can see that that's in flight, and then we get a 200 response back from our create or login. So that's a good sign. If we head over into our inbox, we can see that we did indeed get an email for a login request to My First Project. Now this is something that we may wish to change. If we head back into the dashboard, you can see that we have it here. If we wanted to, we could create a new project. We could also go to project settings and change the project name to Mindful Gifts, and we'll save it. Let's see what happens if after changing the project name, we decide to send another email, send magic link. We can see that our template was updated immediately, so that's a nice feature, the ability to change the project name here. But we're seeing that our login request to Mindful Gifts is here, so let's go ahead and log in. So what's happening is we're going to hit a route with a session token and then ultimately be redirected to our own application here. If we take a look at the inspector, hopefully we don't see any errors, so that's looking good. The problem is that we're not actually doing anything with this session token yet. I can very well visit login and I'm not redirected back home. And in fact, if we look at in application here, we're not doing anything to sort of store that either in cookies or in any type of session storage or local storage here. So we need to set that up on the client side for this particular demo and then wire up our auth guards for our router. So let's look at that now. So if you recall, on the client side, we had this index.ts in our router. So this defines our routes. And we have this requires auth property in the meta object on our home route. So we want to make sure that to hit our storefront, a user is in fact authenticated. We know that we can send a magic link and conceivably authenticate it with our backend that we have set up. Now we need to sort of enforce some of that in the front end. So we are setting up this before each route guard, and we're going to await handle auth, which we're bringing in from this auth guard TypeScript file. And for now, we're just allowing a user to visit the next route that they're trying to get to, and that's where we need to introduce our new business logic. So what we want to do instead is check to see whether or not there is a query parameter for a session token. So we're going to look to see if to.query.sessionToken is a thing, and if it is, we're going to say, hey, we found a session token. Remember, when a user comes back to visit this page, that session token should be set on the URL as a query parameter. So we should be able to get it, and then we're basically going to set that in local storage as a session token key with the value being the session token itself. Then we're going to replace what we have as our URL in the browser to basically just remove that query parameter, set it to undefined here. Then we're going to basically grab that session token from local storage, or if it doesn't exist, it's going to basically be null. And for now, just for debugging purposes, we'll log out what that session token is from local storage to be sure that we grabbed it when we expected to. And then the logic is going to be a little bit more complex, but at a high level, here are the things that we're going to check. First, we're going to say if the route we're visiting requires auth, make an API request to validate the token. So if we're matching some route where there's a meta requires auth value set to true, or that is truthy, we're going to basically try to make an API request to validate the token that we have. So we're going to say try to validate token if it exists. Otherwise, we want to basically redirect a user back to login. Right? So we want to say, okay, we're about to visit a route that requires some authentication. We need to check to see if we have a token from local storage. If we do, we need to validate it using an API call with the token. Otherwise, if it doesn't exist in the first place, just send a user back to the login page where they can then request a new Magiclink to log back in. So here's some of that logic. Things get a little bit complex here, but if we just follow step by step, so if we do have a session token, make the request to the API to verify that token, as we mentioned. Here we're going to be calling localhost port 8080 verified token, which was that last API endpoint we made. We're going to make a post request there with a JSON object with a key token, a property token with that session token that we grabbed from local storage. If things come back as a non-200 type response, we're going to immediately just remove any item from local storage that we have previously set at the session token key. We're going to console log an error here for now, and we're going to redirect a user back to the login view and return. Otherwise, if we have an OK response, what we're going to do is get the result back, that OK response back, and we're going to deserialize that payload and put as into our store the user emails. And so we have a very simple store setup. What I'm going to do is first we'll go ahead and import this. And if we take a look at how our Vuex store is set up, it's very simple. We just have some state here containing an emails array and a mutation to set those emails based on any type of commit that we might make, some action to mutate the state of that emails array. So we're going to commit the user emails that we get back from that successful response to update our Vuex store with those user emails. That way we can use those user emails in any of the views throughout our Vue application. All right, now we have one sort of special use case here where it may be the case that our user is actually trying to visit the login route. Here we'll just console.log that we matched the login route. And if we have a session token, again, try to verify that that's the case, that the token is actually valid by making a post request to verify token, just as we did previously. And if the response is okay, then just return the user back to the home screen here. So this is just a way to get a user who's already authenticated when they try to visit login to just immediately move them on to the storefront in our case. Missing curly brace here. And this should complete the auth guard. Do we have any other issues here? Okay, and this should complete our simple auth guard. So let's see if this works by visiting our UI again. And this time we're going to keep an eye on both network and the application tab so that we can see if our local storage gets updated with the value for our session token. Our inbox will send our Magiclink, which hopefully works for us. Nothing in local storage yet, that's good. And click our login link. We get redirected to our page, and we'll see if we have any issues to resolve. So it looks like we were redirected successfully. We no longer have a query parameter in the query, and that's good. We'll inspect here, and we can look in application. We have a session token in local storage, which is great. So in fact, if we visit the network tab and refresh, we can see that verified token is being posted to, and then we're returning a 200 OK response. So things are looking good there. If we try to go back to login as an authenticated user, you can see in fact we get redirected back to the storefront, which is exactly what we would expect. Now the last piece to hook up here is the sign out button, which currently doesn't do anything. But if you think about it, all we really need to do is to destroy the token that we currently have set in local storage and redirect a user to the login screen. So that should be pretty trivial. We can actually head back into the code, and then in home.view, we just need to simply wire up our sign out method. Remember, the sign out method is bound to a click event on the button to sign a user out. And so really all this really needs to be is local storage.remove item. We just remove our session token key, and then we push a user to the login screen. So if we head back into our application, we can refresh and we can go ahead and click sign out now. And you can see a user is brought back to the login screen. If we try to visit the storefront again, you can see that we can't hit it, and that's because, of course, we have removed the token, the session token, from local storage. So as a start, I think we have a really good start for a very simple application using magic links with Stytch and this passwordless auth setup. I really enjoyed setting it up with Stytch. I encourage you to check out their API documentation and their guides, particularly if you're using Node or Python or Kotlin or Swift or any of the other guides where they have very detailed, wonderful API documentation, SDK documentation. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you got anything out of this, and be sure to check out Stytch. I've been having a lot of fun using it for auth over the last few weeks. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.